Welcome back to the program. We are here today with Professor Zhang, who is very renowned, not just for his academic achievement, but also for his very popular channels. And I'll make sure to leave links in the description. Now, you develop models for predicting geopolitical developments, and yeah, they're quite fascinating because you're able to include a lot of variables to take account for the complexity. Yeah, I thought a good place to start would be a topic which many now look towards. I mean, if you go on any social media, everyone is comparing what's happening in the West to the fall of the Roman Empire. But it does beg the question, though, given that you're able to draw on all these different variables, what do you see make civilizations rise, decline, as well as collapse?
Right. So, in my analysis of world history, I see that when civilizations rise, there are three factors at play. The first is energy, this sort of hunger of the people to rise up and to make their place in the world. That's number one, energy. Second is openness. How willing are you to learn from others? How willing are you to reflect on your mistakes and to improve on them? How open are you? That's number two. The third is cohesion. Do you identify as a people to work together, to coordinate together in order to achieve larger goals? If you look at all great empires, they all started off as these borderland tribes that, because of energy, openness, and cohesion, were able to dominate their part of the world. This includes the Athenians, this includes the Persians, this includes Macedonians, this includes the Romans, this includes the Americans, this includes the British. And today, I would argue like the new empire that's coming out on the world stage is the Pax Judaica, Israel. So among the Israelis, we see energy, openness, and cohesion.
And how do you assess within this framework what's happening with the political West, that is the United States and Europe? Because whatever variable one tends to look at, if it's the politics, the economic, the social cohesion, there seems to be a lot of a gloom, and for good reasons perhaps. So what direction do you see the Western world taking now?
So according to this framework, the Western world, especially the Anglo-American Empire, is in rapid decline. So you look at energy, like how willing are people to work hard? I mean, the reality is that you have these young people in the West who want to be social media influencers. They expect to make $600,000 a year being social media influencers, and that is complete outrageous. And so, Trump talks a lot about bringing back manufacturing to America, but who's going to work these blue collar jobs? Who's going to want to just go and work in factories for like 40, 50 years? And the answer is like not that many young people. The reality is that young people nowadays, they prefer to just watch Netflix. They prefer to just play video games. They prefer to hang out on social media. They really don't want to invest their time and energy in creating a great society. So in terms of energy, the West is definitely in decline. Openness, you see a lot of crackdowns on free speech, especially in universities. You have DEI, and now you have a crackdown on speech that promotes Palestinian rights, that advocates against the Palestinian, what's happening in Palestine, basically. During the COVID lockdowns, you had a tremendous clampdown on free speech. So in terms of openness, we see a massive decline in the Western world. And that is, I think, very problematic. And the third factor is cohesion, right? So everyone would agree that the biggest problem in America is political polarization, where the left and the right hate each other. Nowadays, they've done polling where if you are a Democrat, you absolutely refuse to remarry a Republican, regardless of attraction, regardless of salary. You're like, if you are on the other political divide, I will refuse to engage with you. So in terms of cohesion, America is split pretty evenly between left and right. And this is happening throughout the Western world, especially with the increase in immigration. So unfortunately, all the historical signs are pointing towards rapid decline over the next 5 to 10 years.
It is an interesting development, the rise of political identities in the United States, well, also to a large extent, growing extent also in Europe. The whole idea of the nation state would be, it appeals to some of the, I guess, the instincts in human nature, that is that we divide ourselves into in-groups versus out-groups, and the in-group become quite distinctive, much like we want to reproduce the family. We have a instinct to reproduce the nation, but when the out-group becomes people within your own group, within the nation, and this is how they speak of each other, though, that you said hate, but I think you said hate. Well, they truly see the political opposition not as simply sharing their future, but and having different paths, but they actually see them as a threat to the ideals and the nation itself. And again, it's both sides using this rhetoric, so it's quite frightening in terms of the ability to stay together in one country if this is the sentiment one has towards the political opposition. But to what extent are we doomed, though? That is us here living in the Western world, because there's a big difference, I guess, between, well, we can go through periods of rise and decline, but when do we tilt into collapse here?
Yeah, so that's a great point, where social cohesion is a huge problem in the Western world, especially in America. And so the question then is, why is this happening? Why is there so much social polarization, political polarization? And for that, let's look at 3 theories, okay? The first is Peter Turchin. And he proposed the idea of elite overproduction. And so he looked at the Roman civil wars, he looked at the French Revolution, he looks at all these times of political tumult, and he identifies elite overproduction as the main factor leading to civil war. And his reasoning is that it's not the world isn't divided between rich and poor. It's divided between the have a lot and like have some but want some more. Okay, between the upper nobility and between the lower nobility. The problem is that as society increases in wealth, there's more elite, but there's only a limited positions of power, and so these elite compete for each other for these limited positions of power. And you could argue that's exactly what's happening in the United States right now, where you have these Republican oligarchs, as expressed by big tech, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Larry Ellison, these individuals, versus the financial elite, which is represented by the Democratic Party. So you can almost see that the second Trump administration is really a civil war between these different oligarchs in America. So that's a first theory. The second theory that we have is, Thomas Piketty wrote this great book called Capital in the 21st Century. I'm sure you've read. I'm sure that your viewers have read it. But he proposed the idea that over time, capitalism naturally leads to a renter economy, where if you just engage in speculation, you make more money than if you actually engage in productive labor. So if you put your money in the stock market, you should see about 5% any returns. If you go open a restaurant or you start a factory, you should see 2% any returns. So everyone's going to put their money in speculative capital. And that leads to the over-financialization of society, and that leads to basically financial collapse at some point, because no one's producing any real wealth. And the third theorist is Oswald Spengler, who theorized that all civilizations are organic and they have organic life cycles, meaning that you're born, you rise up, you mature, then you die, and this is just a natural life cycle. And there's nothing you can do about it. So if you look at these 3 theories and you apply their framework to America, America is really in a lot of trouble. And not just America, but the Western world, because how do you deal with elite overproduction? Well, the only way you can deal with it is through revolution, civil war, just through cataclysmic social destruction, where most of the elite is eliminated so that there's more sociability in America. Okay, so Peter Turchin tells us we're screwed. Then you look at Thomas Piketty, and you have the monopolization of capital, the consolidation of capital in America, where now only a few companies account for like a third of stock market wealth, right? So you have the Magnificent Seven, and they account for like a third of the value of the Standard and Poor stock market index. That's very problematic because as monopolies, they don't have to create value. All they have to do is just maintain their position. And that's why we see these, this artificial intelligence bubble happening in the United States, which is very perilous and precarious for the American economy, because you're putting all this money into these data centers, producing a product, AI, that has no actual social benefit and which could threaten to destroy millions of jobs. And then Oswald Spengler tells us that societies die just like as people, and maybe for the sake of humanity, that's a very good thing. So if you look at these three theories, it's very hard to figure out a way out of the social decline that the Western world is facing right now.
Yeah, well, Thomas Piketty, he made, well, in the book Capital referred to, he made a point that that the United States had a better setup for developing democracy, because unlike Europe, where there was a lot of old wealth, they didn't have this concentration of economic power in the United States. Of course, if you forward to the present era, then this is obviously no longer the case. There's also an argument by Alexis de Tocqueville, by the way. But now, of course, it's a very different world. We have this concentration of wealth, which has its consequence. But to what extent do you see the problems of today, though, being an extension of the global financial crisis? Because if you remember back in 2008 and 9, there was a lot of concerns that the US-led economic model had exhausted itself. The US had borrowed too much, spent too much, and some of the energy was gone. Too much cheap money, essentially. But the solution became to borrow more and spend more, and essentially inflate some asset bubbles. And most people would recognize then that this was merely kicking the can down the road. Is this where we are now? The cheap money being kicked down the road? Because I can't remember, in 2009, I think it was about $9 trillion debt. Now they're up to 38 trillion. It's going to be much harder now, and they can't use the same instruments. How do you see this issue of cheap money?
Yeah, so I think you bring up a good point about the 2008-2009 Great Financial Crisis, where the Great Financial Crisis really marked a turning point in American history, and you could argue Western history as well. So the 2008 financial crisis was a culmination of very troubling trends ever since the Reagan neoliberal era. So the first trend was the move from manufacturing to financialization of the economy, where before Reagan, most of the economy was geared towards manufacturing, producing real wealth for export around the world. And with the rise of Reaganomics, then you have a shift towards financialization, where America started to absorb all this easy money from the world and translate it into these risky financial instruments like derivatives and CDOs. So CDOs that caused the 2008 Great Financial Crisis. Okay, that's the first trend. Second trend is the deregulation of the financial industry, the repealing of the Glass-Steagall Act, where retail banking and investment banking were kept separate. And this led to a massive consolidation of the financial industry, and so these banks became too big to fail. So that's the second big trend. The third big trend is basically the elite capture of Washington, D.C. So if you may recall that in the 90s, before Bill Clinton, the Democratic Party was the party of the working class. So they opposed NAFTA. They opposed most favored trade nation status for China. They opposed immigration. Okay, that was the Democratic Party in the 80s. And looking back, I don't think anyone can remember what the Democratic Party looked like in the 80s. But now the Democratic Party is really the party of the professional management class, especially the finance sector. So you have the elite capture of Washington, D.C. And so 2008 was a turning point, because remember, like, Obama ran with the slogan of hope and change. And what he promised was basically to reverse all these trends that were creating this parasitic elite in America. And of course, what happened when he got into office was he appointed Larry Summers. Larry Summers and his team, the same people who create the great financial crisis in the first place to resolve the issue. And of course, what they did was they allowed for quantitative easing. They basically bailed out all their friends on Wall Street, and they screwed over the American people. Most people don't understand this, but Obama was the first Black president, but home ownership among African Americans declined most rapidly during Obama than under any other presidency in American history. So more Blacks lost their homes under Obama than under any other president. So Obama just screwed over the working class, especially the minority working class that was most hopeful for his regime. And 2008, 2009 marked a turning point. And basically, the Democratic Party it has now been co-opted by the financial elite. And this is something that still continues today. So unfortunately, it doesn't seem as though the Democratic Party can reverse this trend.
Yeah, this wealth transfer from the middle class to the rich, it was quite extraordinary. And one would then expect there would be a revolt against the elites as a result. And when we speak of populism, which is now very much demonized as a word, it is the people who are then referring to the elites becoming too detached from the public. But this seems like a very natural criticism or a reaction to this kind of wealth transfer. And I like that you go back to ancient Greece and all, because like a key concern for people like Plato or Aristotle would be that democracy would devolve into tyranny, because the longer any people were free or you had liberty, they would begin to challenge all external authorities. So the son would challenge the father, the student would challenge the teacher. And it seems a lot of our current liberalism feeds into this, though, that you reject all authorities. But it also eliminates then all hierarchies. But, we have good hierarchies and benign. The good ones are, the father and the son, the teacher and the student, where the one wants to bring the other one ideally above oneself. I mean, yeah, that's most fathers who want their sons to do better than them. That's a good hierarchy. But it seems that in society we're losing all of this benign, not all of it, that's maybe exaggeration, but the benign hierarchies are in decline, while we now have the more vicious or extractive, rentier, exploitative hierarchies. They are on the rise. How do you see this development? Because is this then the end of or the death of the democracy and rise of tyranny, or how can we predict how this will play out?
Right. So let's look at ancient Rome. Okay. So after the Punic Wars, the 3 Punic Wars, Rome was the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. But it had this war machine that kept on going to start wars overseas. Why? Because the entire Roman economy was based on starting wars. So what would happen is this nobility would start these wars in order to capture slaves to run their estates. Now, when they start out these wars, they would conscript these peasants. And because these peasants could no longer work the land, they had to get loans with their land as collateral. And of course, because of bad luck, because they got killed in the war, the family would lose this land. And so what would happen is that the nobility would consolidate all this land, and the peasantry became a renter class, and they were forced to go in the city of Rome to look for work. And this became a very unstable element in Roman society, because now you have the rise of populism. So the first major reformers were the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius Gracchus, and his entire reform platform was the most innocuous, the most reasonable platform ever in human history. All he said was, hey guys, so our peasant class, they can't work the land anymore because there's no land for them. But we, the Roman state, have all this public land that's not being used. So let's just give some of this public land to these peasants who want to work hard and grow food for the family. And that's like the most reasonable strategy in the world, right? The problem is that the nobility treated public land as private land. So even though they weren't actually using this land, they still thought this land was their own personal land. So they took affront to Tiberius Gracchus' proposal. And what they did was, on the streets of Rome, they beat him to death. Not only did they beat him to death, but they also beat his brother to death. And these are known as the Gracchi brothers. So, I mean, I understand populism sounds bad, but if you look at history, look at how the ancient Greeks treated their peasant class. If you look at how the ancient Romans treated their peasant class, the elite becomes arrogant, become complacent, and they are completely resistant to reform. In fact, if you propose any reform, they will kill you. And this allows for the rise of these adventurers, these demagogues that are able to harness the anger of the people and turn them against the elite. And of course, in Rome, it was that this allowed for the rise of Julius Caesar. Now, what allowed for the rise of Julius Caesar was something really, really simple. He treated people with decency. You know, he went off to Gaul to start off these wars, and rather than take all the plunder for himself, he would actually give it to his soldiers, and that engendered tremendous loyalty among his soldiers. So much so that his army was able to defeat the entire Roman Empire and establish Julius Caesar as the dictator of Rome. Of course, this would eventually lead to his assassination, but then this would lead to the rise of Octavius Caesar and the establishment of the Roman Empire. So, if history teaches something, it's this. The people don't want to rise up. The people don't want to rally behind a demagogue, but the elite often do not give people a choice because the elite are parasitic, they're arrogant, and they're completely indifferent to the plight of the people. And this is something we're seeing throughout the Western world today, where the elite live in their own bubble. They don't understand the suffering of the people. Look, the reality is that in America today, most of the people cannot afford an emergency that costs $500. If they get sick and they have to go to the hospital and they have to shove $500, they can't do it. The groceries are going the grocery prices are skyrocketing. They're heavily in debt. I mean, if you're an average American, life is really hard for you, and you really don't see any possible exit. Look, 2016, okay, we would live in a different world if in 2016 Bernie Sanders were the Democratic nominee. And honestly, if the Democrats had a fair Democratic primary like the Republicans did, Bernie Sanders would have been the nominee in 2016 and 2020, and he would have won the presidency. But they insisted on rigging the primary, and this allowed for the rise of Trump. So Trump would not have been possible. Trump would not be feasible without the fact that the Democrats are a very corrupt and very arrogant and very out of touch party.
Yeah, well, I also tend to look at populism as a mechanism to a elite that becomes more decoupled. But you make a good point, though, that the populists do not always have good answers. I mean, they have the finger on the pulse of the public. They respond to the attachment. But I wanted to ask about Trump for that one reason, though, because in Europe especially, there's no journalist or politician who can understand why the Americans would have voted for him. To be honest, I would likely have voted for him if I was American, just to throw a wrench into the system, because it wasn't sustainable. It was going from bad to worse. That doesn't mean that I think his solutions are very good. I think his tariffs are a mess. They don't work. The idea of always solving all problems with these quick fixes and through strength, and now more and more war, I think it's not a great approach. But not understanding his appeal, I think that's quite dangerous. But how do you see him going down? If again he would make a prediction here with Trump, do you see him dissolving democracy, or is he able to hold the elites accountable, or how do you see his path forward?
Look, in 2016, the entire world was shocked, bewildered, confused, perplexed, disturbed by the fact that he was able to beat Hillary Clinton, who is a career politician. She was a Secretary of State, also the First Lady. She has tremendous political experience with a team of like thousands of career politicians solidly behind her. So she would have been a very effective politician and president if she had won. And the Americans didn't want that because, as you say, they were sick of the system as it was. Hillary Clinton would have just been another corrupt politician that looked after her friends and screwed over the American middle class. And so, they did these interviews with these average Americans, and they were asked, like, why did you vote for Trump? Even though he was not a reliable, not a experienced politician. And their response was, because I want to assert my authority, because I want to assert my agency, because I wanted my voice to matter. I'm sick of being pissed on by the elite. That's the reason why. This Washington elite this elite in Washington, D.C., in San Francisco, in New York City, they don't even know I exist. And now by electing Trump, they know I exist and that my voice matters. And, that's why they voted for him. And then in 2020, the people didn't want the division that Trump caused, so they elected Biden, and their lives got worse and worse. So they're in a situation where, if they vote for who they're supposed to vote for, this person just ignores their plight. This person will do nothing to improve their livelihood. Trump, on the other hand, is someone who could throw a wrench in the system, as you point out. This is someone who can disrupt the status quo. And he's doing that right now with Project 2025, right? But the people certainly don't want the things to stay as they are, right? So people are voting for change, even though it may lead to chaos, in the hope that their life might get a bit better.
Let's burn down the current house, hoping that something else will come in its place.
大家好，我是主播周玉琴。很多的朋友告诉我们，选择原版的太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌，它添加有羽衣甘蓝，健康再加分。而有睡眠困扰的朋友们，赶快选择蓝色包装这一款晚安加强版，绝对是更有感。每日克菲尔，时刻美好 ，Good Feel Good。请上快点购为健康下单，而且要记得输入推荐代码，有额外的折扣优惠。太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌基础版、晚安加强版新包装改版，内容不变，抽取更方便。要吃就吃最好的。